Good evening and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And tonight I'm pleased to welcome back to our show an old friend of the show, Mr. Larry Spivack, the president of the Illinois Labor History Society. Larry, pleasure to have you back.
I'm glad to be here.
So let's talk a little bit about labor history. You know, you and I have known each other for a while, and we've had many conversations, both on air and off, about the state of the economy, the state of the average American worker, and drawing the relationships between what happens or has happened with the organized labor movement and where Americans stand at the moment. So before we go into the context of that, though, let's do a little place setting. What's the state of the average American worker today? Where does that person find him or herself?
Well, one of the good things about the current campaign for president on the Democratic side is that this is now a question that is out there all the time. What has happened to the worker is that over the last 30 to 40 years, wages have been stagnant, almost 40 years now, meaning that for the cost of living, wages are no more than what they were in 1980, 85. So you think about that, that says that while there's been tremendous growth in the economy over those years for 1%, 5%, 10% of the population, the vast majority of Americans have seen absolutely no gains.
So it's important to put that into context. So the economy has grown, as you say, over the last 40 years, so since, say, 1980. If we think about where we were in 1980, this is really before the computer revolution. You know, it's before many innovations that have changed the face of the country and have made enormous fortunes for people in various industries. So for that 40-year period, from 1980 till now, there have been huge gains in productivity, enormous gains in wealth creation, and yet that wealth, that enormous increase in wealth, is not flowing to the people who are, well, you can argue who's creating what, but the people who are working everyday jobs, they're not seeing any of it. That's really what we're talking about here, right? So
That's
40
correct.
years,
Yes.
all that gain has gone to someone else.
It's gone to really 1% of the population. I guess you could say the upper 20% has benefited, but once you start looking at it in terms of the actual numbers specifically, the vast majority has gone to 1%. The top 10% of America is doing well. The top 20%, or the upper quintile, is doing reasonably well. But again, all that wealth that's been amassed is literally in the hands of a handful of people. As we know, there are 3 people in this country that own the same amount of wealth as almost half of all America.
And
so
those being,
well, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and I can't recall which billionaire of the 2 or 3
right.
own, you know, such hundreds of billions of dollars, which is the lower half. 50% of America does not have that amount of wealth.
And this is concentrated in 3 people.
Yeah, and that, you know, 350 million people, that's 175 million people do not have that.
Collectively.
Collectively.
Don't have as much as these 3 have.
That's correct.
Yeah, that's astonishing.
But probably more important, that's a nice thing to use in a political discussion, but more importantly, the impact is that most working people have not gotten a raise in 40 years. Even though people may have gotten 2% here, 4% there, 3% there, over time it's been offset by inflation. And with the rise of productivity, one would think that it would have been greater. You talked about the computer revolution, and what we know is that that has really, again, gone to just a small percentage of the workforce.
So what does that mean in terms of stability in the country? I mean, we've seen historical precedents where this great wealth and income disparity has led to, in almost every case, some level of social unrest. So today we live in a time where there seems to be a fair amount of social unrest. Can we draw these lines from this issue of wealth and income disparity to the kind of social problems we see today?
When you talk about social unrest, some people would argue that there's not enough. And I say that in a historical context, but also in terms of what is America and why is it so different from the rest of the world. If this, some of the things that Americans face, if it was France, if it was Italy, if it was Germany, if it was Scandinavia, millions of people would be protesting in the streets. But while pensions were taken away from the vast majority of American workers who had them, literally taken away, while the middle class pays for all the tax cuts to the wealthy, while housing is out of control in terms of costs for most people, and people can't afford $400 to pay for a car repair, that's 50% of Americans would not be able to scrounge up for $400.
That's terrifying, by the way.
It is. It is terrifying, and people, of course, we know the fact that people will cut their medicine in half so they can eat, and all of those kinds of things. We're the only country that people don't get into the streets about these matters. And so while that's a whole long discussion about why that may be.
Can you give me the elevator pitch about
Well, I think
why
the
that is?
elevator pitch in some ways is written by Stephen Greenhouse, who's a columnist and an author who just wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times. He calls it the American exceptionalism. The exceptionalism of the American worker. That term, American exceptionalism, has been used many times in different contexts, but it points out how America's history is such that in the end, Americans really haven't learned to identify with the concept of collective action, because we were taught to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, that we conquered the West, that we do it by ourselves, when in fact the irony is, and the greatest contradiction, I think, of all in our social relationships, is that the very wealthy always understood collective action. That's why they're rich. That's why they have what they have.
They built corporations.
They built corporations, which, by the way, are called people now,
Yes,
since
aware of that.
the late 19th century. And it is easy when you have collective power. And that's why the wealthiest people understand that association is the way you make progress. But then we teach, no, it's bad. That's socialism. That's communism. That's un-American to use that collective power, yet they reserve it for themselves. And that is manifest in how you just look at the highest weight, the most significant in compensated professions, and what do they all have in common? Take athletes, take screen actors, and take the medical profession, take CEOs, and often people talk about lawyers. Many do make a lot, not all do, but they have something in common. They all have a union. What do I mean by that? Well, not only do they have a union, if you take like the screen actors, you take the most talented people in America, athletes, they all have a regular
Strong
union,
unions.
and they have agents to represent them. They don't have enough representation. If you take CEOs, companies, corporations, they have association upon association upon association to represent them, to lobby for them, to write legislation for them, to negotiate for them. But when it comes to the worker, corporate America has said since the inception of industrialization is, you're bad if you want a union. You're not American. And so even when America finally achieved the density of 1 out of every 3 workers in the union, the first thing that Congress did, based on corporate America's desire, was to pass the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947. And from then on, it has just been a downhill slide.
So what did Taft-Hartley do?
Well, this goes back to 1935, when after literally a revolution in industrial America with strikes after strikes, especially 1934, and during that period of the Depression, when there was great upheaval because these things, what would it take? President Roosevelt pushed for the New Deal and helped get legislation. He signed the legislation called the National Labor Relations Act, and it for the first time gave unions the right to really organize in this country legally and to collectively bargain. Within the period of 1937 to 1945, America went from 10% organized to 35% organized, and within that period of time, suddenly all workers were essentially represented, and we built a middle class that the world had never seen. And so that was really quite astounding to the corporate America, who after World War II said, we got to stop this. And so because there was massive strikes taking place across America after the war, with all the soldiers coming home and the pent-up demand for the ability to have housing and better wages, the strikes caused the right wing, basically, and even Democrats were okay with this for all intents and purposes, passed legislation that really put a kibosh to the ability of unions to organize as well as they could by certain tactical changes in the legislation, saying that states could now do something, which is pass legislation that calls for right-to-work laws.
That happened back in 1947?
Yes, that's correct. And so, and as of the last 5 years, several more states passed right-to-work legislation, which basically is called the right to work for less.
Yeah. Yes.
That means that the union cannot require members to belong to the union, and that it's an open shop, and they don't have to pay dues, and that means you represent them, but they don't have to pay dues. So your organization can be almost bankrupted if unions didn't work hard to keep organizing people.
So the right-to-work laws have always struck me as being, in one sense, absurd. Now, not from the perspective of those who want to put them in place, because they benefit those who are owners of capital, not laborers. But the right to work says that you're essentially mandating freeloaders, because the union, as you know, the union represents everyone in the shop, but only the volunteers have to pay. Everyone else can get those benefits without paying. Sort of defeats the purpose of having a union, because you can't maintain it if people aren't paying.
That's correct.
Which is, of course, the whole point of these laws, right? So why do these laws seem appealing? I mean, at some point, you talked earlier about why isn't there a general uprising? Even in states where right-to-work laws go into effect and workers see themselves falling even further behind, why isn't this seen? Why don't people, the people who are affected by this, understand that this is what's causing these problems?
Well, of course, it goes to the heart of why do Americans vote against their own self-interest time and time again. I mean, people do all over the world, but probably nowhere like the United States. You know, how do you live in the richest society on earth that can't provide medical care for most, for millions and millions of people, where, drug costs are more than anywhere else in the world, side by side with Canada, and then you look at Europe, and we're the only country in the world, the richest country in the world that is 21st in education and at the top of the tier now in infant mortality. We could go on and on about those things. And a lot of it has to do with, I guess, I would say, the propaganda that goes way back, really, to the 19th century and the Gilded Age, when America was a country that was beginning to be industrialized, and industrial leaders saw that workers were trying to organize unions, and it began with this idea of the 8-hour day. The idea that you would actually cut their profits by paying people 8 hours of work when you were paying them that same wage for a 15-hour day, that is just an assault on the owners of that Gilded Age, which we now have, that Gilded Age.
A return of the Gilded Age, right?
Yes. And so the propaganda was unions are bad, organizing is bad, immigrants are bad, black people who aren't slaves anymore are bad, and so we all hate each other. And we all hope one day that we'll be the millionaire, or nowadays when we all hope we'll be the billionaire.
Right.
And so that is really the story of America.
So let's jump then to today's America, and we see tremendous anger. I think what we see with the resurgence of racism, misogyny, all these kinds of isms that we thought we had locked away into Pandora's box are reemerging. And we talk about the disaffected people who are feel that they've been left behind, and in fact, the statistics support that they've been left behind. So is this, it seems like there's this line we can draw from these actions and from these laws that have been passed to today's unrest, and even as you say, it may not be, level of unrest that maybe is justified. Nonetheless, this anger, this sense that they've been left behind, and that somehow the system is rigged. This seems to be the case, that the system may in fact be rigged.
People are correct. People are right to feel that the system is rigged. They're right to feel that they've been left behind. If you've gone 40 years without a wage,
without a raise,
without a raise, yes, you've been left behind. Especially when you look around and what we see on TV and in media, or the rich and famous, and what we all thought we would one day be able to have. And so most working people play by the rules and end up with no more for those reasons that we just talked about: unfair taxation, a country that spends 17% of its GDP on health care when the next country closest to us is 11.5%, and most countries that have national health insurance are at 7-8%. That's, $1 trillion every couple of years. So yeah, you're not going to be left with much, and you're going to be angry. But if you're being told that it's because some people across the border are taking your jobs, even though you would never have those jobs, you would not be a strawberry picker, you would not be picking apples, you would not be working in the meat processing plants that are paying sub-minimum wage in Mississippi, where they just rounded up 600 to 700 people today to deport them and separate them from their kids, when in fact it's the owners who should be held responsible.
Yeah, somebody hired those guys.
That's right.
Knowing that they were here
and that's a
without
whole nother
documentation.
discussion. Right. But so we think that the guy next to me is our enemy. The great example is back during the period of the Chicago Stockyards, one of the greatest industrial institutions, great meaning just in terms of history and in terms of what it meant to America. Upton Sinclair wrote about it because of the 1904 strike there. But what happened was that the industrialists pitted the European immigrants against each other. And so they could never organize, because the Lithuanians thought that the Poles were the bad guys, who thought that the Swedes were the bad guys, who thought that the Germans were the bad guys. It goes on and on.
Right.
And then during the Great Migration, when blacks came up from the South in the order of 3 million people and came to work in the stockyards as strikebreakers, not knowing it, they thought they were being hired to get jobs, then white people said, see, they're coming to take our jobs. And so it literally took until the 1930s to get now not just the white ethnic groups organized together, but African Americans along with whites, to realize the enemy is the boss. It's Armour, it's Swift, those are the guys. There have been many periods in America when people organized despite their differences, because they finally realized we're in this together. But that's so much that exploitation of what shouldn't be differences among people is the secret of the very wealthy, of corporate America.
Divide and conquer.
Divide and conquer.
Set people against each other, and they won't come after us.
Exactly. And you see it right now. The United Auto Workers have been unsuccessful in organizing the foreign auto factories in Tennessee and in Mississippi.
Well, in fact, and yes, using that example, a few years ago, the Volkswagen plant, where Volkswagen was fully expecting a union because they're the European company.
And they're unionized everywhere else.
And were not, in fact, even opposed to the union. And yet somehow the union vote failed.
Well, and that's the subject, again, of labor law in America. It's pretty well an objective fact. It is an objective fact that the labor laws in this country are more backwards than any developed country in the world, just as is our health care and these other matters. I know that I sound like I'm not pro-American when I talk about this, but this is exactly why I am pro-American, because this should be a fundamental right of people to be able to have access to organize. That should be a human right, and it is almost everywhere else in the world. Why not here?
Because of the power of those who control the wealth, and it's become even more concentrated, which translates into even more power.
how I would see it.
So there's a very interesting book that I've read recently about how what the concept of economic freedom, we hear the word freedom tossed around a lot, but economic liberty and economic freedom used kind of interchangeably, that is espoused by the corporate class, or actually it's seen as a fundamental libertarian tenet, really means going back to the era where I own this company, you work for me, I set all the rules and you have nothing to say about it because it's my money and I get to keep all of it and you don't have any say in what goes on. And that is the fundamental underlying truth of economic liberty, this concept of economic freedom, economic liberty. And that in fact what that leads to is those who control the wealth recognize that ordinary Americans don't want that. They don't believe in that philosophy. And so if you have a well-functioning democracy, eventually people will rise up and say, we're going to change these laws because they're not working for me. And so the enemy of economic freedom is actually democracy. And so the idea is that democracy has to be curtailed because it doesn't allow this concept of economic freedom for those who hold all the purse strings. And so today, as we see voter suppression, we see extreme gerrymandering, we see the stacking of the courts, these are all part and parcel of an effort to undermine the basic tenets of democracy, because democracy is the enemy. People want fairness. They want a fair shake. And who was it? Eisenhower said, people of the world want peace so badly that someday they're actually going to step up and demand it. And that's the same concept here. So what's the response? How does organized labor, which has been badly damaged over the last few decades, reorganize? And what kinds of options are available to Americans to turn this around?
Well, it is more difficult in America because, as we've talked about, Americans are familiar with the concept of collective action. There are periods when they have been, but the idea is somewhat foreign to them because we treat it as if, even though the Cold War is over, you would be labeled a socialist, you would be labeled a communist, you would be you'd be un-American. That's usually how it comes out. And so, you know, patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel, but of course being patriotic is to fight for a better place. That's what it really should be. So I guess that not having a simple answer to this question, I would say the easiest thing would have been to elect politicians who would support changes in the law, but that hasn't gone all that well because remember, we have Citizens United, and politicians over and over, even ones we call progressive, take PAC money, and as
PACs
long
being these political action committees.
Political action committee money, and because it takes so much money to run a campaign, when your donors are saying from the insurance lobby, from the energy lobby, you could go on and on, you're going to say, well, I can't run unless I have some more dollars. And so that's difficult to overcome that. Yes, labor contributes to campaigns, but it's just minuscule, minuscule in
compared
comparison,
to corporate dollars,
especially when you talk about soft money. So that means changing legislation can be difficult. It happens, you know, but there are things that we're seeing now, such as we haven't been able to change labor laws, and but we may need to change minimum wage laws, get maternity and paternity leave for workers.
And there's some progress on those
So
fronts.
these things are happening because there's such a pent-up demand for it. It's so lacking in America, and with only 1 out of 6 private sector workers having a union contract that have these things, and 12% overall of workers being in a union, because the public sector is much more highly organized, where there are pensions and there's more time off, and it's all related again to collective bargaining. Then maybe through social legislation, which, you know, that's like Social Security, things like that. hopefully there will be some kind of health care for all. It won't be the fight to negotiate over health care increases instead of a wage is one reason that it would be great to be available to Americans as a form of a human right instead of negotiated or given by an employer.
And in fact, that's not a new concept. We go back to Roosevelt, FDR,
Yes.
who felt that health care was
Teddy Roosevelt.
Well, it even goes back
Yes.
to Teddy.
Yes. This has been on the table, so to speak, for 100 years and or more. And for even Richard Nixon had talked about national health care. It's not a new concept, but for reasons that have to do with a very powerful insurance industry in this country that runs our health care, makes the decisions about the very private things that we deal with as opposed to our medical practitioners, it's difficult to overcome. It can be overcome. I don't have any doubt that it can be, but it's requires now I think the politicians having the courage to take this on, and some of them are. But, you know, the fight for 15, the concept that there should be a living wage by any American is now kind of like everybody, I say everybody, but, you know, you start talking about 70% of the population polled believes the minimum wage should be set at $15 an hour at minimum.
Yeah.
And the minimum wage, if it kept up with inflation from 1968, really would be $35 an hour right now. So.
That's astonishing.
Yes.
I mean, to think about how much difference that would make in the lives of people who are today working for $7, $8, $9, $10 an hour. If they were making 35, their lives would be substantially different, and that money would come from this enormous pool of money that has instead accrued to the owners of capital. In fact, the economist Thomas Piketty, who wrote the book about how capital will eventually win out over labor, he was trying not to be pessimistic about this, but the capital had such an advantage because that's where all the money is, the people who are the actual capitalists.
And they have the weapons.
And that's
a story of our history, but that's another matter.
Yeah. So there's kind of a call to wake up America. In the past, it's taken major problems like the Great Depression, World War II, to turn people around. And I know it's an unfair question to ask because we only have like a minute left. But is there some other way we could do that? In 30 seconds, can you give us the answer to all the country's problems?
Well, I think that the right to organize is fundamental to a democracy. And we have to keep telling that story. That may be a long road. I think in the short term, it's just simply a matter of not hoping, but being active in this next political cycle, that the candidates that say they're for the kinds of things that perhaps I'm talking about right now will actually step up if they get elected and support them. But that means...
On that note, Larry, we're out of time. So we'll have to continue this conversation at another time and place. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll have you back again.
I look forward to it.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. We've been visiting with Larry Spivack, the president of the Illinois Labor History Society. Please see us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, or find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So till next time, thank you and good night.